Oh yeah. All right, here we are, 3 weeks after the dev stream, roughly 3 weeks after the dev stream. Let's see where the dust has settled and where we land. A lot of people already made some deep dives into what the patch notes are. Like I saw Bear and Robberlove's games, they both made some pretty big videos, and I definitely do recommend watching them. But for this one, I wanted to take a little bit of a step back and see how Airborne is going to change the whole war on a more strategic level. Before I get into any of that, I do need to give Siege Camp, the developers of Foxhole, a huge shout out here. This update has been phenomenal. From beginning to end, yes, there's some like things to mention here or there, but overall, this update is amazing. We can already look at the dev stream and how much people have been diving into the dev stream, or the dev branch, I should say, to test out these the planes. It's been going crazy. I've never seen a dev branch anywhere like this, where so many people are logging on so consistently and for so long to just practice their skills in flying aircrafts, and they are truly fun. So again, thank you, Camp, for making this happen. I'm very excited to go into it. Um, so let's go into it. So first of all, I want to tackle some of the heated discussion we've been seeing, and that I've also been hinting at in the intro, specifically on Reddit. They are talking a lot about the balance of things and how things are broken, and I need to emphasize this quite a bit throughout the video. We currently have seen, and we've only seen the balance play out in Dev Branch in a world and an environment where all the resources are infinite. All the discussion about balance and whatnot, they need to be taken with like a large pinch of salt, because the resources and time it takes to get an aircraft going and the whole war setup, it's not there. It's not a real good comparison to what's going to happen in a real war. So at the beginning of Dev Branch, people were homing in quite a bit on the carriers, the Mercy and the Poseidon, on the colonial side. And while on the surface that makes sense, carriers in the way they are released aren't as impactful as people make them out to be. So there has been like a whole discussion about which carrier is stronger and which carrier does things better. But in the end, I don't think it really matters. The carriers themselves don't have a lot of offensive powers on their own. Obviously, because their offensive powers is supposed to come from the planes they're launching. However, in this case, in Foxhole's case, the carriers can launch fighters and scouts, and of course the dive bomber. And while the dive bomber is a very necessary addition to launch from a carrier, it doesn't make up for the cost to actually deploy one. So fighters, scout planes, their main targets are essentially air targets. This causes for a problem, like targeting only air and a little bit of naval stuff, but not enough naval to actually take down, large ships. You're really risking a whole lot of resources in a very expensive large ship with a lot of very expensive airplanes on them to achieve pretty much a defensive role, a defensive patrol, or I'm not even sure what it's trying to achieve. So to illustrate this a little bit heavier, let's imagine you're doing an op with an aircraft carrier, either Warden or Colonial One. Now you're going to deploy somewhere, you're going to station there, and you're going to launch your airplanes. Now, what do you want them to do? they can patrol the skies, they can look for targets, and maybe they can catch like a small boat or something. But in the end, I don't think that's worth it. Especially with the new introduced small boats. They're pretty capable boats, especially the light boats, not the gunboats, but the ones with the anti-air armament. Trading an airplane for even 10 of these boats is just simply not worth it. An airplane is so expensive compared to these boats. They're costing like the latest numbers I got was around 250 BMATs. So you're really fighting with like almost a battle tank worth of stuff against 250 BMATs, like 2.5 trucks. And I don't understand that trade off. So I do see them shine in certain aspects if you want to really lock down an airspace and prevent other airplanes from coming in. Maybe to protect some of your own arsenal of your, like if you want to plan like a bigger op of bombers. I can see them coming in handy there, but you might as well just launch with the bombers. So again, I feel like the whole discussion about the aircraft carriers, one being better than the other, it's for me it's a meaningless discussion, because in the end the result or the impact of an aircraft carrier, and I don't really see it having a really big impact. So luckily they did bring the cost down from the aircraft carriers to something a lot more reasonable, because the initial cost of the aircraft carrier was very high. It was more than a battleship, which crazy amounts. But in the end, if you have such an expensive tool and your actual counter is to do, literally nothing, or spam some very cheap boats, I don't really see it being used a whole lot outside of the role-playing aspect. Which, to be fair, a lot of equipment has survived a long way just on role-playing. And flying airplanes and refueling them quick and fast is kind of fun as well. But outside of that, I don't really, see the purpose of it. And this has brought me to my main point. The dev branch, while it's been great and it's really been fun, has really distorted the perspective of the costs of everything. Yes, there are some changes to the resource spawn rates, but we don't really know how much that's going to impact. And on top of that, there's also going to be more players, so more people to distribute the cost to, with all the faster resource spawns. But, circling back, the cost of these planes are quite high. They exist of two components. They're mainly the rare metal costs and the component costs. A lot of people compare either one of the two and call it a day, but let me just list them right here. So let's look at a fighter, for example. We'll have a frame, one engine, and 5 hull parts. If we'll add all the PC mats together, we'll get to 445 PC mats. And in addition to that, 40 rare metals. Now let's compare that to a battle tank. I have the Warden ones here, but the Warden and Colonial costs are pretty similar. The Warden battle tanks comes in at, of course, 0 rare metals, but at a 525 PC mat price tag. So you might be wondering, what's the problem? We see battle tanks all the time, and they're pretty reasonable to manufacture and everything. Well, my main problem here is that a fighter airplane or aircraft is manned by just one person, while a battle tank is manned by 3 to 5 people, depending on how dedicated you are to actually man the battle tank. So not only the cost per person to fly an aircraft compared to a battle tank goes up drastically, it's also a lot easier to lose or get at least some extra cost to an aircraft if you for example, land a little bit weird or something like that. It's quite a flimsy machine. It's quite fun, but it gets damaged quite easily. So what this means for the war is that we won't see any major shifts in the early releases of the airplanes. The major ships will come in the later airplanes that have a lot more capability to actually impact the front lines. But the earlier airplanes are simply too expensive to actually, especially for their capabilities. They don't really have an impact. The only impact they really have is on the naval front, where they are a sort of a counter, or they at least take part in the naval sphere, in the island sphere. It's kind of what the devs are leaning towards, but for the actual front line, these aircrafts are not really going to have an impact. In general, this is also like the biggest shift in the Airborne update. It might as well be called the Naval 3.0 update, as our bear kind of hinted at. But he's very right in saying that, because a lot of a lot more ships got added this update. 3 warden ships, 3 colonial ships, and 2 neutral ships. And this adds a lot more depth into the naval, into the island gameplay. On top of that, we also have the scout planes, and they're very much naval focused. We also have some other planes, famously the seafighter that can also land on water, but also like the colonial troop carrier. So there's a very high emphasis on the island sphere. This also makes a lot of sense for the devs, because they spend a whole lot of time designing new islands, pretty massive islands. In total, there are like 10 new hexes, essentially the two big islands that I expect we're going to fight a lot over. The island hopping has been something that's been very much lacking from Foxhole, because previously we had a naval update, but we didn't really have these smaller ships that could kind of roam around the islands and take over some stuff. Now we do have them. They're not super great at actually sieging an island or something like that, but they do add a lot more gameplay in these hexes that was desperately needed. So, what will we see in the next war? What do I expect, and what do I want to do? Let's talk about it. I expect the naval hexes to be a lot more contested. I already, alluded to it before. There's a lot more gameplay in the naval hexes. It's going to be a lot more fun. There's probably a lot more resources in the naval hexes. And transportation by ship is actually quite efficient. So I do expect naval hexes to be a lot more populated in the next war compared to previous war. I'm not sure if they're going to be more populated than land hexes or coastal hexes or something like that, but there's just a lot more gameplay there, and there's just also a lot more airstrips there. On top of that, there's the ships that I mentioned earlier. There's plenty of them, and they're also very cheap. And I think that's one of the key parts to this update, that the new ships they added are very cheap. Most of the ships only cost B mats, with a couple of ships costing some R mats, and then obviously there's the old expensive ships that cost like, that you build in a dry dock and cost rare metals and all the factory stuff and so on and so forth. But on top of that, there's also going to be a very cheap scout plane, which I do expect to just, be spammed pretty much everywhere, because it's the airborne update and everyone wants to fly. So everyone is going to build scout planes. They're going to be pretty much everywhere. And they fit very well in the naval hexes. On top of that, naval hexes will not have a lot of air intel. At least there are going to be a couple of islands that will have the air intel, but most of the islands just aren't big enough to build a whole air platform on them. And there are going to be just a lot of gaps in the air intel. So the island hexes will be free for the smaller planes to fly through without being on intel. And you can just surpass a whole lot of the map by just going over these island hexes and going straight into the back line to do some scouting, or to, be annoying and shoot at a truck or something, something like that. And what I want to do during this, especially the early game, is I want to combine the scout plane in combination with the very good old Skycaller, and using the fire rockets, because I've used the fire rockets a lot actually in previous wars, and I really want to use them in combination with the scout plane. Not only do I want to use the scout plane to spot, but also to preemptively kill the fire trucks. Because if there's something that kills a Skycaller op, it is the pretty much the presence of a fire truck, where someone can just go in there, spray everything, and everything is just fine. And a Skycaller op can consist of a lot less than, for example, the I forget the name, the armored car that shoots the 10 explosive rockets instead of the fire rockets. So you can use a lot less vehicles per op, and be very effective by trying to burn enemy bases down. Even though, technically a explosive rockets is a lot more, ensured impact, if you want to call it that. On top of that, howitzer range also got reduced on tier 2, so it will be very easy to spot the tier 2 bases and shoot them from outside of the howitzer range, and not get any retaliation on that. Anyway, that's at least my plan for the early war. Mid-war is usually where the land battles get a lot more interesting. Artillery unlocks during this phase, and there are usually a lot more bigger shifts during this phase. But I still want to focus more on the islands during mid-war. One of the interesting concepts that I want to have is the landing beach. Where as a warden you can use a beach to land both the scout and the fighter plane without actually needing a runway. So you can use a beach setup to fuel and arm and resupply and repair fighters and scout planes. But you can also use the same beach setup to actually launch small boats ops. So having one supply point to actually supply the two types of airplanes, plus a lot of the naval stuff, the smaller naval stuff, I should say. So gunboats, the mortar boats, the small boats, and the medium boats. And having like a small setup like that, see, how well we can run it, and kind of break through some of the open areas on the oceans, maybe take a couple of the island change. I don't expect to be like, super effective or something like that, but I do expect to be able to use like these small, very cheap to build points to actually use these for some very quick operations to take a couple of islands. So later on, I actually see a huge problem with this airborne update, and it mainly has to do to the bombers. The bombers are a really powerful tool in the airborne update. However, they're pretty uncontested. And sure, you can use fighters against them. However, you don't have the amount of time to set up fighters to actually respond quickly to bombers. And you'll say, why don't you build like more air intel centers? Well, the thing is, a bomber requires about 2 minutes to cross a hex. And within that time, you need to get to an airfield to actually get out your fighter, to build it, to refuel it, to rearm it, get it up in the air, and get to where the bomber is. And by the time that bomber already bombed the shit out of you and already went away to its home region, or well, to where it came from. So yeah, that's what I see as a big opportunity, of course, but also like a big problem. I like the bombers. It's a very cool design, but the bombers they just have too little counterplay. The other counterplay would be like flak cannons, and yes, they would be effective, but again, within 2 minutes you need to, spot them, which, you're not gonna have full intel coverage. Realistically, within a minute, you need to redeploy to home island. You need to go to where you need to defend, um, and go into like a flak cannon with two people, because it requires two people to operate a flak cannon, and actually start shooting at the aircraft. And sure, this works if you know very far in advance that they're coming, but it just doesn't work if the bombers aren't going as deep and are literally targeting your own air intel. Because the air intel bunkers, they also they're from concrete. So if you kill them, you kill quite a bit. So in the end, what does this mean for the war? It basically means that the front line, the no man's land, the territory that isn't captured by any faction, will increase by quite a bit, because both factions have access to these bombers. Yes, people will be more inclined to use fighters to have regular patrols and try to shoot down the bombers even after they already bombed some stuff. And that will of course cause some losses. So I don't think it's like a completely foolproof strategy, just like use bombers or something like that. But it does mean that the front line, like both factions, will probably target the frontline bases uh, with their bombers, and that means that the front line is gonna separate quite a bit, which opens up quite some interesting gameplay where there's a huge no man's land where the front has to go through to actually get to the enemy, and then the enemy can easily respawn there. This might, cause a stalemate, but this also can swing in one way or the other, or swing on the east front for the Wardens and on the west front for the Colonials, something like that. There's a whole lot, it's hard to predict, but it's pretty clear that the front lines will open up quite a bit. And of course, on top of that, we also need to take into account the island hexes. I do expect one of these sides to get taken completely by Colonials, and one of the sides to get completely taken by Wardens, but also there will be a couple of islands, regions that will be probably white, no man's land, which is a good place for bombers to kind of go to, set up, and start launching their operations from. And at that point, the bombers can actually start targeting more backline regions or midline regions, so to say, which interesting dynamic, but we'll have to see what actually happens. The last thing I really want to talk about is the paratrooper plane. Not just the plane, but also the paratroopers, because at the beginning, during the dev stream, when the paratroopers were announced, and especially the invisibility of the paratroopers from Intel, pretty much everyone was talking about that for a couple of days until Dev Branch launched and everyone started talking about something else. And there hasn't been a whole lot of changes to the paratrooper plane, or specifically the paratroopers. The biggest broken part about the paratrooper plane and the paratroopers is actually becoming invisible. Even with like a tiny amount of explosives per paratrooper, this can cause some serious damage. I mean, you only have to imagine a front line where you're constantly watching for like a big blob. Usually these get called out pretty significantly, but if you have a paratrooper plane and you just or drop 12 people off at the front line, they will be invisible for, latest I heard is 30 minutes. I might be a little bit wrong on that, but even if it's like, let's say half of that, 15 minutes, 15 minutes of invisibility just gets you around the front, gets you to the Logi line, maybe get you to a very good flank to do kind of whatever you want. If you have some cutlers, you know, or some lunaires, you can use those with the paratrooper, and then it's just so much time where you just get to like freely set up and actually start shooting and stuff. And the only way they're going to know, the enemy is going to know that you're actually doing that with like 12 people at the same time, is when they see structures disappearing from the map. That's the only way they're going to know. And now, you know, I'm not just saying one plane. How about we do 2 planes and you have like 24 people that are literally just going to jump out of the plane with some explosive stuff and it's just gonna wreck a base. I think paratroopers are not discussed enough. I want to use the paratrooper plane a lot during the next war, and I'm quite excited about that. But I hope they're gonna make some changes real fast to the amount of invisibility you have on Intel. Anyway, that's my review of the Airborne update, and that's also my plans on what I'm trying to do next war. Let me know what you're trying to do next war, and hope to see you there soon. Cheers!